Live here.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen, grab my. Okay, we should be live. Let's see, we got 7 so far coming in. Can you guys let us know through the chat session that you can hear us? Hey, I can hear you. We got, looks like we're live.
That's good.
We'll just wait a couple more minutes. We've got a total of 35 people that are planning to attend this, and so far we've got 14 online. So we'll give it another couple minutes and we'll get started. Okay, we're at about a little after 1 minute after 12, so we'll go ahead and get started so we can start on time, end on time. Welcome everybody. My name is Stephanie Aiden. I'm Executive Director of AIA Spokane, and this is our third remote, live, and local produced webinar. And today's title is Money Pit or Great Potential: How Understanding Environmental Considerations Will Help You and Your Client. If you're an AIA member, you'll earn 1 HSW credit. And the way I'm going to log that is I need you to email me at office@aiaspokane.org with your AIA member number. That's important. And I will go ahead and get that recorded for you. So moving on, this webinar is presented today by GeoEngineers, who's one of our great AIA allied partners. So we're happy to have them on and providing such important content. Our presenters today are Bruce Williams, who's an environmental engineering principal, and J.R. Segalski, who's an environmental engineer. And our moderator today is April Smith, who's a senior marketing specialist at GeoEngineers as well. We do encourage Q&A throughout the presentation. There's a Q&A section, not the chat session, but there's a Q&A section within Zoom. If you can go ahead and type in your questions, April will moderate those and present them to the presenters in a timely way. So please feel free to do that. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Whoops. And I'm not going to go through the program description because you guys all read that online, and that's why you're here today. But I will go through the learning objectives because you will be, learning, earning credit for this. And so what you'll learn today is know when Phase I environmental site assessment is required. Learn what environmental considerations to look for when purchasing and developing properties. Understand what environmental constraints are easy to address and which could lead to extensive costs and regulatory hurdles or impact human health. The fourth one, identify opportunities to combine environmental and geotechnical services during the design and construction. And finally, you'll hear recent examples of parks, private development, and schools where straightforward environmental steps led to successful development without excessive costs or delays. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters, Bruce and JR. Again, we encourage your questions. Just use the quick Q&A section within Zoom to pose those. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, the GeoEngineers is very grateful and thankful for the opportunity to present to you and AIA. Thank you very much for that opportunity. So our environmental assessment program here is going to come up, JR, with There we go. Money pit or great potential. So I'm sure many of you and that have worked on projects before have dealt with environmental projects that ended up being a money pit, and sometimes have thrown the schedule off, thrown the cost off. And oftentimes it was because there wasn't enough planning conducted up in front of the project. And so one of the things that we want to describe to you today is not only how a Phase I and a Phase II ESA work, but how you can help your clients understand the environmental risks associated with purchasing a property, and how you can also help them find opportunities to finance this project, and strategies to incorporate designs that account for environmental contamination. So this morning, I'll kick it off with just talking about managing an owner's risk, and then JR is going to go through the environmental checklist, the Phase I environmental assessment, site assessment, which essentially is a paper study coupled with a site visit, and also a Phase II ESA, which is a more intrusive investigation with samples collected. And we'll also discuss some of the strategies that you can use when dealing with sites with contamination, as well as several project examples towards the end of the presentation. So in terms of managing risk, we can never completely eliminate all risk to the owner associated with environmental or geotechnical investigations. We just can't simply can't see through dirt, and so we can't identify every issue that might be out there. And I've been involved in a number of projects throughout my career, and every once in a while you find contamination on a site that you didn't expect, despite all the due diligence that you've done to assess it. For instance, I worked on a site several years ago where we did a very thorough research of the site history and followed up with a Phase II investigation. And during site excavation activities, an underground storage tank was found that had never been documented, and it delayed the project and added costs. So you can't get everything all the time, but what we can do is we can reduce that uncertainty. The more data that you have, the better that you can understand the site, and you can risk that uncertainty for the owner, such that they are making an informed decision about the environmental risks that might be present on a site. And that way we can create some cost-effective approaches that you can manage that and mitigate that risk to the maximum extent. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to JR to talk about some of the Phase I, Phase II work that is required on most development sites.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. One of the things I just wanted to touch on briefly is just when you're starting a project, just for, just overall environmental considerations. There's a lot of things that should be done up front to help you avoid delays in your project. Really, a Phase I ESA, we're going to talk about those. Make sure that's been completed for the site. That's really the first step to protecting owner liability, and seeing, looking and identifying if contamination or historical site use could impact your development. And then, hopefully, if that Phase I recommended a Phase II, that's been done as well. Some of the other things to look out for is just taking a look at aquifer protection areas where the site's at, making sure your stormwater infiltration is not going to impact a drinking water supply, or your proposed activities for this site, aren't going to be prohibited because they're located in an aquifer protection zone. Another thing to look at is your critical area ordinances. You're going to be looking at threatened species, protected animals, looking at wetland buffers, setbacks, when you start preliminary looking at the site to see if that's going to affect your development. And of course, the SEPA checklist going through, that's going to be required. Something else to look for is to see if your site you're going to be working on and developing has got any wetlands. They could even be seasonal wetlands. If you see something that may be considered a wetland, it's always a good idea to have an environmental professional come out, review the site, check the quality of the wetlands, see if they are wetlands. look at, potential mitigation issues so they're not going to affect you once you get too far down the line. And again, stormwater, that comes up a lot. Beyond just shallow bedrock that can pose a problem for stormwater disposal, in the Spokane area, we typically infiltrate stuff. So it's looking to see if there's an existing connection to the stormwater system. There's not a lot of capacity in that system, even though they're redoing it. So you need to consider that. And of course, the presence of contaminated soil could also impact that. So really, when you're starting these early on, planning phases, these things should be looked at ahead of time. We're really going to focus on kind of the phase I, phase II, and environmental considerations. So phase I ESA, I'm a car guy and I do a lot of my own repairs, but it's still a good idea to have a pre-purchase inspection done when I'm purchasing a used car. Probably would have saved me a bit of work on my latest project if I would have done it, but that's hindsight. A phase I ESA is pretty much the same thing. It's a pre-purchase inspection with environmental focus for a site that you're looking to develop. Not only does doing the phase I going to give you some owner protection and liability, it's also going to be required by most financial institutions to finance a project. But really, it's a cheap tool to identify any environmental issues that could be a problem, or a headache once the dirt starts moving. Something I did want to note is that if a phase I ESA is conducted for the current property owner, there could be some issues on who can use that phase I, some third-party reliance stuff. So even though phase I has been done for a property, it's good to make sure that the intended user is approved to use that document, and look at getting that done early. So, the whole thing with liability really comes down to CERCLA. It was created in 1980. It's an old, law regulation. A lot of folks are hopefully familiar with it. It's also known as Superfund. It's a behemoth legislation. It's huge. We don't need to go into the details. But really, what's important there is you need to understand that there are some protections in there for site owners and developers to talk about. So really what should get your attention is the Superfund part of it. And really that gets apparent when any past property owners or lessees for a property can be held responsible for contamination on a property, even though they didn't cause it.
Hey, JR, can I step in and just add a comment here?
Yeah.
And regarding the Superfund, the CERCLA legal background, and if there's any attorneys on here, they can probably speak to this better, but I know that the terms strict, joint, and several apply to Superfund law. And really what that means is there could be 10 people that have owned or operated a property in the past, and some probably have a higher degree of liability associated with contamination on that. But if you're the current owner and you haven't done your phase I ESA research, and all those other parties are, for whatever reason, not economically viable to contribute to a cleanup, it gets stuck with that one person that still is holding the bag, as it were. So going through the phase I ESA process relieves that burden.
Did you have a question, April?
Yeah, so one of the questions is a phase I required? And if so, when? So as you're going through, that might be a good time to answer.
I would say most financial institutions are going to require one if there's going to be financing. But if you buy a property, you're not required to do a phase I. But as we're talking about, that could open you up for some liabilities if you didn't do your due diligence. And you could be liable for that contamination after you purchase that property. So, do you have anything else to add, Bruce?
No, that summarized it. Thank you.
Okay. So we're just going to talk briefly about the liabilities, for different type of owners. Really, that phase one offers some protection underneath the innocent landowner's defense. It's just your basic due diligence that's used to identify potential contamination that existed at the property before you purchased it. So, it's really if contamination is found after you conduct that phase one, you may not be responsible for it, but there's still going to be some responsibilities of the current landowner to go chase that down and find somebody who's responsible for it. If they don't want to pay for it. Phase two can also be used to identify contamination from a neighboring property. That's one of the things that we look at. So you'll see that a lot with some aerial deposition contamination and some groundwater contamination. The phase one really offers protections under that for your contiguous property owners. And really the last liability protection is one where a purchaser willingly buys contaminated property. You can get in there and buy a piece of property you know is contaminated. You may not be liable for that contamination, but there may be what's called an environmental covenant that requires you to manage that contamination. And that could have some groundwater monitoring requirements, soil monitoring requirements and whatnot. So definitely be aware of that. So this kind of goes in with the question that was done. What's needed to get financing? A lot of times a phase one ESA is required. And I'll tell you, I do get phone calls a lot that somebody says, hey, I need a phase one. I'm closing in a couple weeks. How much is it going to cost me? When can you get out there and do it? And, phase ones have become a little bit of a commodity. There's a lot of folks that can put them out, quickly, cheaply. They've got all that information together. And there's folks that specialize that. And if there's not big concerns for a site, you're looking at an office building in virgin land. There's not a lot of historical site use around there. Those are great. If you're just looking to check that box, those are good. If you're looking at a development in an area to where there's a long site history, the area has been redeveloped multiple times, there's been questionable industrial activities on there, it's good. You're probably going to want to pay a little bit more for a phase one. You're not going to want to rush that, and work with somebody that can take a holistic approach that can say, okay, I've seen this stuff before because I've done the phase twos and the cleanups for this, and that they can start thinking of that, if issues are encountered during that phase one. So, what's included with a phase one? Like I said, it's really important to get that done early on because that's going to be your first, paper desktop study to see if there's any red flags. There can be some lead times to get all that because with a phase one, there's a lot of historical documents that you have to get through public records request and other companies and whatnot, and even scheduling interviews and all that takes time. And we did want to point out too that phase one ESAs for property transactions, financial institutions, they do expire. So after 180 days, if that property transaction hasn't occurred, you will need to redo it. A lot of the times you can go back to if it's very recent, you can go back to the last person that did it, and usually you can work something out to renew that.
Hey, JR, just another comment on that. I mean, with COVID-19 and agencies closing their doors, it's difficult for us to get records currently. And that has added delays into the time that it takes to do a phase one ESA, or else we can provide it on time, but we recognize that it's incomplete because we haven't been able to track down all the regulatory agency file reviews that we wanted to do. So
yeah, good point. So a little bit more, like I said, phase one ESA desktop study, it's a record review. So you're looking at chain of title documents, you're looking at aerial photographs, building department records, land use records, even city directories, checking the address to see, who is there, what kind of businesses or people occupied that space. Meeting with Department of Ecology, they've got a whole file room where they track known or suspected contaminated sites, seeing if it's there. You're looking at historical site maps. There's historical fire insurance maps you can look at. And it also involves a site visit. You know, that's really good to get your eyes on the ground, where you're looking for stained soil, drums. In this picture here, I thought this was a good example. This looks like an innocent house, but you see a little pipe sticking up next to the gutter there. Well, that pipe's more than likely a vent pipe for an underground storage tank for heating oil that was used to heat that house. If you're not on site, you're definitely not going to see that, and that's some of the hidden things there, which the phase one would say, yeah, there's a vent pipe there, but we don't know if there's still a tank there. We don't know if it leaked. It could be closed in place. Those are a lot of unknowns, and I'll get to that shortly. So, and then just the bottom there, you know, we're also trying to interview, you know, regulators and past and current landowners. So really with the phase one ESA report, your biggest thing you want to focus in if you're looking at one of these documents is going to be your RECs, your recognized environmental conditions. And those are the ones that are going to identify, hey, there was a UST on the ground. Hey, there was, you know, stained soil, stuff like that. Did you want to chime in with a question, April?
Yeah, we have a question about, do phase one ESAs identify existing or previous easements for the property and what the easement is for?
I
Typically,
don't think so.
No, typically they don't. That would be more of a title search. That can be added on to a phase one to do more of a title search, which would reveal easements, but that's typically not found in the records research that we do.
Yeah, it's more of an environmental focus, not so much survey. Survey and physical location. That's more when I talked about some of the other stuff ahead, looking at those buffers, setbacks, easements is probably another good one to look at as well. So, you know, with, like I said, the meat and potatoes of the phase one is going to be your recognized environmental conditions. And the phase one should also provide an opinion on those recs to say, yes, we think that it is a concern, it should be further investigated, or no, this looks like it was addressed historically with these records, and it doesn't look like it needs further investigation. And really one of the products of the phase one is going to be a yay or nay on a phase two. Recommend one or not. Again, just briefly, you know, some of your common recs are going to be, this site is listed and is known to have contamination or suspected to have contamination by Department of Ecology. You're looking at USTs either in place or that they have been remediated, closed a place where they've been known to leak historically. Additional recs from a phase one include historical operations. If there's been dry cleaners operating on the property, there's been heavy industrial use, if there's been service station handling of fuel, petroleum products, chrome plating facilities, which, you know, can release some other contaminants into the ground, or identifying neighboring properties with known contamination. So really, you know, recs can really kind of make or break the deal and say, yes, we need to move to a phase one, or there's just too much here to deal with. There's too much unknowns. Maybe a phase two is going to cost too much, and it could be a go, no go for the project, and you can just stop there. So again, that's why it's really important to have enough time to get these things done ahead of time.
And oftentimes the the potential buyer could ask the owner to pick up the cost, or at least share the cost of those phase two investigations, because it's certainly in the seller's interest as well to move that property. And there have been projects where that cost sharing agreement has benefited both parties.
Yeah, a good point. That helps with kind of the transaction price, and I think I'll talk a little bit about that later too, with actual funds for cleanup too. So just real quick, if you're out on a site with a client developer, you guys are looking at doing some work, you're just looking at the site, getting a general feel. If you're looking around and you see a bunch of fill dumped on there, piles of soil, stained soil, you smell any weird odors, you see a bunch of drums piled on the site, if it's known to have suspected or contaminant, if it's known or suspected to have contamination through Department of Ecology records, if it didn't get very far and you're working on your geotech investigation and the geotech finds a bunch of fill, then you're probably going to want to look real hard at conducting a Phase II ESA. So what does a Phase II ESA involve? If a Phase I is done for the property, that's great, because the Phase I can guide the Phase II, and we can identify areas to target for further investigation and specific contaminants to look for. If you're looking for any contaminant under the sun, there's a good chance you could find it. But really, it just helps dial in the contaminants you're looking for and the areas to focus on without just doing a shotgun approach at a site. It will involve the physical collection of samples. That's why it's beneficial to combine it with your geotech investigation if you can, because you're going to have an excavator out there to do test pits, or a drill rig out there to do direct push or hollow stem or rock core borings. And then less common, you could see folks going out there and getting grab samples or wipe samples from a building, but that doesn't happen as much. So really what that Phase II does is it almost confirms the presence or absence of contamination at the site, and it provides real numbers for contaminants of concern that you could compare those to cleanup values to say, yes, the site's contaminated, or no, it's not. Unless there are some surprises that the Phase II miss, which can definitely happen, like Bruce mentioned about the hidden underground storage tank. The overall goal of a Phase II is really, if you do have a contaminated site, is you want to find and identify the contaminated media, be it groundwater, soil, or surface water, and you want to find those extents. It's not uncommon to get out there and through an iterative process, multiple mobilizations out there. If you don't find the limits of contamination, you may have to do a couple more steps to find that. We can field screen for some contamination. Petroleum is really easy to do, or easier, I should say. But there's other contaminants like PAHs or metals, which are a little bit more difficult to field screen for. So you've got to wait for that laboratory analysis to come back and determine if you've met those limits of contamination. But really defining the horizontal, vertical extents of your contamination really benefits you if you're looking to continue development of the site and clean it up and hopefully incorporate it into your site development plans.
Yeah, JR, I was just going to define a PAH as a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, so that's why we call it PAH, because that's a tongue twister. But essentially, that's a byproduct of combustion, and we see it in rail yards oftentimes, post fires, coal, gas plants, those types of facilities where incineration of material was part of the process. Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. I'll talk a little bit more about contaminants because that really dictates your cleanup approach for your site development too. So just some considerations when you're headed towards a Phase II. Just keep in mind that environmental laboratories are generally on a 2-week turnaround time from the time they get the sample. They can turn around faster, but it could double your price. Yellow iron availability is always an issue. Drill rigs, getting excavators out there. So scheduling that can be difficult. This is invasive sampling, so you've got subsurface utility locates. You may need to get a private utility locator out there if you're on private property and they have a bunch of private utilities that the one call is not going to catch if there's electrical lights going out to a parking lot light. That's a responsibility of the private owner. And if you're going through a formal cleanup process, I'll touch base on those a little bit. there could be some additional time to get everybody to agree on a sampling and analysis plan, a work plan for that investigation. So, and the last thing I want to touch on is just if you have some preliminary site information when you're out there and you're going to conduct a phase 2, it's great. That way you can combine it with your geotech work. If you got an idea where stormwater is going to go or roughly out at the building, get those two birds with one stone and get that information at the same time. Looks like we got another question.
Yeah, one of the questions is, do you deal with arsenic often?
Yeah, it's a metal. We've got a couple site examples about that, but it is MOTCA regulated. It has a cleanup level. It was used as a pesticide, and it's pretty common to find that in soil.
Yeah, there's actually, I mean, there's background arsenic concentrations in our area that are about half the cleanup level, the MOTCA cleanup level. And so it's a constant contaminant that we see, especially in Spokane, just because it's a naturally occurring metal.
Yeah.
And it occasionally occurs at concentrations higher than the cleanup level, and there's statistical means of documenting that that's background, but it has, you know, pose issues and additional work to discount that as a contaminant or address it if it's, you know, man-made.
Yeah, and it's naturally occurring in our soil too. I've seen cases where microbial activity has actually freed it from the soil and mobilized it into water too. Let's see, did I get through this one? So, all right. So if you've gone through the phase 1, phase 2 process and the phase 2 has identified that you've got contamination at your site, doesn't mean that your property is a money pit and you're just going to soak a bunch of money into an environmental cleanup. If you be strategic about it and plan for it, you know, from the get-go, and you've got an idea on what you're dealing with. You know, ecology is your partner in this. We've got a great office over here. All the folks at ecology are great that I've worked with, and they do need to be notified. That's in the MOTCA regulations by law. Depends on if they're the level of contamination and how it's mobilizing or whatnot. But, you know, typically you'll see that they should be notified within 90 days. It's a phone call, email, a letter, just something simple to let them know that it's there. They're a great tool also to help you identify funding sources, which I'll talk to a little bit, and they'll help you comply with the laws and regulations. They're not an, aha, got you. No, they want to move you through this in a good way. So, as Bruce mentioned, pHs, that's a type of contaminant, your polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Really, the phase 2 is important to help define what your contaminants are, because that helps you develop a cleanup strategy, you know, for that. Different contaminants are remediated different ways. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but a building is a great cap for metals and pHs. You put a big concrete slab on there in a building, that's great. But if you're trying to construct a building over some VOC contamination, some volatile organic compounds, that also includes your BTEX, you know, petroleum products, chlorinated solvents, you could run into vapor intrusion issues there. So that solution doesn't apply there. And really, if you've got contaminated soil, you should really think hard about your cuts and fill balances, where you're going to move soil. Exporting contaminated soil can get very expensive, but there are some ways in the regulations to allow you to manage that and use that on site if you can come up with beneficial uses for it. So if you've got contamination, the next thing you want to do is you're probably going to want to move to a cleanup plan. If you're going to continue to develop the site, you want to move the project forward. We think we can, you know, deal with this contamination. You're ready for it. Really, you know, every site's really unique based on location and the contaminants and the planned use. Everybody wants that NFA. Hey, my site's got an NFA. It's not contaminated. It's clean. Until they start moving dirt and they find another UST that nobody found. It's also important to note that just because a site has an NFA, like I said, doesn't mean that there's still not contamination at the site. You can get an NFA leaving contamination on the site if it's managed appropriately, and if you've got ecology's buy-off, ideally from the whole process all the way through. I did want to talk too about environmental covenants. You're seeing a lot more of these. If there is contamination on site, these are going to be a title document. They're going to accompany the property, and really it's going to put restrictions on the property use. You may have to notify ecology if you start digging in the ground, so they can be there to observe if you found something that they didn't know there was before. It's probably gonna prevent groundwater withdrawals, because they don't want people consuming potentially contaminated groundwater. If it is or is not contaminated, there's a lot. And it also can put restrictions on stormwater management. One of the big things you can't do is you can't be focusing and concentrating your stormwater disposal through contaminated soil.
Yeah, and the environmental covenant restrictions are not too onerous. It's mainly don't make the problem worse and notify ecology when you're doing things such as excavation. But it does sometimes pose problems if you are trying to develop a property and to include a groundwater source on that property, because that can really restrict that ability for that new owner to draw groundwater for whatever use is required.
Yeah, for sure. So where are we at? All right. So addressing contamination at your site, steps to getting that NFA. Like I said, ecology really, they do want to help you, and it's important for them to be involved from the beginning. If you're going to be developing a contaminated property, the VCP is a good option, especially over here on the east side of the state. I've heard on the west side it is a longer process over there. But really what that's going to do is, as you develop any phase II assessment plans, cleanup strategies, you can get ecology's approval along the way, in their opinion, so there's less risk of when you get everything done, they go back and say, well, you didn't sample for this and you guys didn't look here. It's just an extra check to help you move along, and instead of doing 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you can keep the project moving. Another way to do it is just an independent cleanup action. That's great for a small site. You've got a good idea on the contaminants. Ideally, if it's just, hey, we're just going to dig this out and get rid of it. If you've got a good environmental professional on your team that can help guide you through there, you can pretty much just collect the information as you're doing the cleanup action, document everything, and then submit a document to ecology. It says we had contamination. Here's what we did. And ideally, they would come back, with an NFA and say, "Yep, you guys did a great job. We don't see additional action as necessary." The last one is going to be an agreed order. That's a long formal process, lots of lawyers, and it's an RAFS, remedial investigation feasibility study. It's a really long drawn out process, and you typically don't see that unless ecology is really requiring remediation because there's an immediate risk to human health, or the site's continuing to release contaminants into the environment.
Yeah, that really wouldn't be applicable for 99% of the property transactions, but there might be a very complicated site with a long history of contamination, and what that agreed order process provides is a legally binding release of liability because it's signed by the state attorney general's office. And so unlike the voluntary cleanup program or the independent cleanup action, which ecology just provides an opinion, the agreed order process is legally standing in terms of its final outcome.
So a question for Bruce and JR, how do you chase down contamination from other properties?
Well, access to that other property can be an issue, and hopefully that's somebody else's problem, and that's over there. If that contamination is on your property, and it's not well defined, I think somewhat would be, the burden would be on you to help define the extents and prove that it came from that neighboring property. You know, and if you've done your phase one and there is documentation that says there was offsite release from that, you know, that definitely helps. Anything else to add, Bruce?
Yeah, I was going to say the burden is unfortunately on the owner of the property that's contaminated by others, and often that can be a legal process as well as an environmental assessment process. But you are protected from contamination that comes onto your property that's not your fault. It could be a lengthy process to address that, and so it's a consideration that owners need to look at when purchasing a property. Is there a cleanup already in process, and is it well documented that the adjacent property owner is the source and is the responsible party? So it's just a little bit more due diligence on you or the owner to identify that.
Yeah. Okay. Just want to talk here. There are funding sources out there to help you, even with a phase one, even with a phase two, and even with a cleanup action. You know, there's brownfields grants through the Department of Ecology. Department of Commerce actually has, you know, quite a bit too. We're the EPA. There's opportunity zones within the city of Spokane. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they've got a whole list of sites like downtown, Kendall Yards, Lower South Hill, Sprague District, the Yard. The city of Spokane's already procured some brownfields funding. And if you're looking to do a project in that area, they can help you with that phase one, phase two, you know, project, so that you can get a piece of property that's been sitting vacant. It's just kind of been sitting there. They want to get those stuffs built and revitalize those areas. So that's out there. And again, you've got some remedial action grants too, which is more for a cleanup side from Department of Ecology. The thing to remember with these is that most of these funding sources are going to require your work plans, your sampling and analysis plan. It's a more formal process they'll have requirements for. So it's definitely going to take a much longer lead time to get your project going. And this stuff needs to be done well ahead of time. One of the other things too, as we talked about briefly, if you've got, you think it's a smaller contaminated site, you think digging hall is going to work, setting up an escrow account with the seller is a great deal, and then setting aside the rest of the purchase price and putting a time frame together to get that remediated. That's a good approach. And then depending on when the release occurred, you can also go with some insurance coverage. There are some companies out there too that can go back through many, many years and try and find an insurance company to help pay for assessment and cleanup.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment to that, JR. It generally, properties, and I think it's 1982 when the legal cutoff occurred, but if contamination occurred prior to 1982 and there is an insurance policy in place for the owner that covered just general liability, you know, your slips and falls type insurance, that might be covered. Your environmental contamination cleanup might be covered under that policy because it was about that time that insurance companies put in environmental exclusions or pollution exclusions into their policies. So prior to that, if you have the insurance documentation and you can certainly prove that the contamination occurred before 1982, you can have that insurer cover the cost of cleanup. And currently we're working with a major university to address contamination, the pesticide contamination that occurred back in the 50s and 60s. So it's just another avenue available to owners.
Thanks. Okay, hopefully I haven't bored you guys too much with phase one, phase two, liability, and all that sort of fun stuff. We've got here some project examples from the local area that I think help. We can help show you some creative ways that contamination was addressed. One of the things we did want to touch on is a few of these are in downtown. If you're doing any work in downtown Spokane, you may be aware that shallow bedrock can be difficult to deal with, but it's not hard to find contamination either, especially your metals and pHs. They had the fire of 1889 that released a whole bunch of pHs and metals. There's lots of railroad down there, lumber mills. Beyond just questionable fill for wood waste, they use a lot of petroleum products too. And then, general just industrial processes really around there. But just because you've got that contamination on your site doesn't mean it's going to be a money pit. pHs and metals are your primary contaminants downtown. They're fairly easy to mitigate. They don't migrate in soil very far, and they tend to stay near the soil surface. A lot of times you can cap those on site with a building or a paved parking surface. Which are some of the strategies we used here for Riverfront Park. I saw a lot of folks here that registered for this course have been involved with this project, and perhaps we worked together. I saw folks from NAC, Hill International, DCI, Kaufman, throughout the multiple redevelopment projects. A lot of firms have been involved, and it's been an awesome project. But really, we've been lucky enough to assist with environmental and geotech on this project, and because it really was such a large area, it was really important for us to develop more of a streamlined assessment and remediation approach. There was all sorts of historical use. There were rail yards, dry cleaners. There was a gas station on Havermill Island, right by Howard Street. When they built Expo 74, my belief is they pretty much just dozed everything over, brought in fill from who knows where. It could have been contaminated, covered everything up, and made an awesome, beautiful park. It looked great on the outside, but what lies beneath was really the question. So when we started looking at that, at our approach, really what we want to do is the Parks Department work to identify each specific revitalization area. So instead of just shotgunning and assessing the whole park, nope, where's the work going to be focused at? And through that, we used the Phase I that was done for the park to target areas and contaminants for investigation. We conducted the Phase I with the Phase II, I think, in all these projects. So we were able to identify contaminants that we may have to deal with during the project, as well as the geotechnical considerations, which was, I think, a great strategy. Let's see. We did find contamination. Again, it was primarily metals and pHs. And what we did is we worked with the city and Department of Ecology to get the park into the VCP program. We worked them to submit our plans throughout construction. And we developed a site-wide soil management plan that said, depending on what contaminants were in the soil and at what concentrations, how we were going to manage them. If we just exported all the contaminated soil on the site, it would be millions and millions and millions of dollars. So what that plan did is it really identified soil reuse strategies at the site. We worked with the design teams and contractors to come up with creative solutions to cap a lot of the soil at the site. And one of the biggest challenges with stormwater is avoiding infiltrating stormwater through our contaminated soil that remained on site. The property will have an environmental covenant, but it's public property. I've been here all my life, and I hope the city never sells it, so it shouldn't really affect any property values or transactions. It'll just be on them to manage that environmental contamination that remains on site. The Sportsplex right next to Riverfront Park, this is a conceptual drawing of it with the stair ramp coming up. This is under construction right now, and you can see the north bank for Riverfront Park and the playground that they're building right now. The Sportsplex building and slab, it was a great cap for metals and pH contaminated soil. What that concrete does is it prevents direct exposure to those metals and those contaminants. Metals and pHs, your primary exposure pathway is going to be ingestion. You got to eat it, got to get it on your hands and smoke, or kids eating dirt. And I didn't think kids ate dirt until I had kids, and they eat a lot of dirt. But once you've got that concrete cap there, you've cut off that pathway and it's protected. There were some other challenges though with the sportsplex. The Carnation Dairy was in that footprint, and there was a service shop and there was petroleum contamination. So some of that stuff was dug out. There were records of UST leaks on there that were addressed. We were able to go back and assess that, and we were able to get an NFA, for the petroleum contamination at the site. So I'll start speeding up a little bit. Looks like we're
Hey,
getting
JR, just before you go on to that, and you brought this up on both the Riverfront Park and the Sportsplex projects. A plan was developed early on, and ecology was brought on early on to get their buy-in on the approach, and that resulted in a savings of hundreds of thousands of dollars for both projects, as well as mitigated some of the exposure routes, as you mentioned. So just emphasizing the point, work with your team and get the regulatory agency involved early, and it can save you, if not millions of dollars perhaps, as well as schedule delays.
Yeah, and I will say too, that soil was beneficially used, for
Right.
filling areas, and it wasn't just literally throwing money in the garbage because we hauled off a bunch of dirt to landfill.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Last one I got before I turn it back over to Bruce, Omak School District. They were looking at developing some areas, building some new schools. They were looking at some old orchards. Well, guess what? Lead arsenate was a common pesticide used, and lead and arsenic are all over the soils in old agriculture areas, especially those orchards. There was also some, they used diesel fuel not only for the equipment, but they had pipes running all over the place to power the little windmills that project heat out to protect the crops from frost. And fortunately, those pesticides, lead and arsenic, they are heavy metals and they tend to stay on the ground. They're not real mobile, and they will stay, they will stay in shallow soils. So once you can work to find the vertical horizontal extents, we came up with some creative areas to with cut and fill balances to move that either under a building, underneath a paved parking area. And then, if we needed to do some exporting, we focus more on exporting the clean fill, so that could be reused and not exporting contaminated soil. So I'll turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks, JR. So just a couple more projects. In 2014, 2015 range, we worked with the Spokane Teaching Health Clinic property. And during the geotechnical investigation, it was clear that there was a lot of soot material, cinders, bricks, scrap iron, other materials. And that prompted environmental testing of those materials, and similar to other areas where there were rail operations, there were contaminants from metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, as well as the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the PAHs. And so we were able to define the extent of that, but we were also able to work with the design team to kind of tuck those contaminated materials under the impervious surface in the buildings, because they didn't pose a vapor hazard and they weren't going to migrate, so they could be put beneath the building. And the only places that we really couldn't have those contaminated materials were in the landscape areas and where there was stormwater infiltration facilities. So that was an example of just trying to mitigate the impact by utilizing that soil as best as possible, so you didn't have to export and import soil from the site. Another site is the Daybreak development. Very similar contamination. Lead specifically was found during the geotechnical process, and we worked with the design team to identify means similar to the teaching clinic on how to address that contaminated soil, and not only for workers in the area that were doing the construction, but also for end users of that. And so the plan with that property is similar. Concentrate those contaminated materials, which are not volatile and not likely to leach to groundwater, and construct impervious surfaces over that and just avoid those materials where there's potential exposure routes like landscaping and also utility trenches and stormwater facilities. And then the final project that, and we're all familiar with this one, Kendall Yards was vacant for I don't know how many decades until about 12, 15 years ago when it was undertaken as a potential cleanup. And this is again a former rail site, a lot of debris on the site, a lot of history other than rail use. There were dry cleaners and tanneries and foundries and other facilities there. And so we worked with the former owners as well as ecology and EPA and the city of Spokane to develop plans to address the cleanup. And you can see the volume of contaminated soil that was removed from the site. At that time, the owner wanted a pristine site and removed the contaminated soil perhaps more than they needed to reduce the risk, but that they just wanted that clean bill of health, and they thought that it would, probably provide them higher property value. But right now, you go to Kendall Yards, and it's a vibrant community. So this is just an example of people putting their heads together, coming up with solutions, and it has an economic benefit for all of the once it's developed.
All right, there's some today's.
Yeah, there we go. So I know we're about 5 minutes to the end here, so just wanted to wrap up and give you just a few takeaways that we discussed early on in the beginning. If you can help your client understand the environmental uncertainties and the risk associated with that, or team with an environmental consultant to help you with that, that's going to help your owner, help your client maximize their opportunities to understand whether this property is worth buying and developing. And also you can develop some strategies to design around that. Speaking of strategies, JR mentioned some of the funding mechanisms to address contamination. It's useful to have these in your back pocket so that you can help your client if they do find contamination on the property, that they can consider alternative funding sources to address the contamination, and just have a kind of a general legal and regulatory understanding to know that maybe some of this contamination, the cost of the contamination remediation can be borne by other parties. Also just, minimizing your impacts to schedule and cost. If you combine your subsurface investigations and allow some flexibility in the schedule and cost, you can be more effective for your client and maintain the schedule that they expect. Nobody likes to be surprised in the midst of a project, and we've all been there. You find something along the way, and it really impacts the schedule and the end fees to complete the project. But just looking at that early on and finding ways to get around that will help you and your client. And finally, there are design strategies to address contamination, to limit the amount of import, assuming that you have a good structural fill. You can work your site layout around that. You can design your stormwater and your landscaping and utilities associated around to avoid the contamination. And obviously an important thing is just to mitigate that risk to future users, and especially mitigate the risks that might go to groundwater. And those are some of the takeaways we wanted to share with you. We certainly appreciate your time today. And Stephanie, thank you very much for inviting GeoEngineers to present to your group. And I think we can open it up to any questions you might have.
So far, I think you answered all of them. So good job.
Yeah, are there any further questions? Just please use the Q&A box, and we have a few minutes that we can pose those questions if there's anything that we've left unanswered.
Pretty good.
I don't think, it looks like we you answered everything. So good job, guys. So anyway, I just want to thank GeoEngineers for taking the time to, I know it takes some time to put together these presentations. You guys are thought leaders in this area, and we truly appreciate it. And I know that we had 32 panelists that are attendees at this particular presentation. So that's a great attendance. And again, thank you. I want to just remind everyone again that if you are an AIA member, please email me at office@aiaspokane.org with your membership number, and I'll make sure and get you credit. And for those of you that are out there that are coming across some great ideas or thoughts, or know of some good thought leaders of a particular topic you think our membership would be interested in, please email me, because we're always looking for really good topics. I think these webinars are in our future, and I want to continue to offer them to our members and our ally partners and to anybody that finds it interesting. But I need to always have some good topics and some good thought leaders to do these presentations. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude. And thanks again for everybody attending, and especially to GeoEngineers for putting together the presentation. Until next time.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.